Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. This is an hour dedicated to understanding a little more about ourselves, our beliefs, and how we approach enlightenment. Indeed, an hour devoted to learning something more, not just about the world of shoes and ships and sealing wax, but about how, what, and why we think as we do. An hour for the open-minded, willing to challenge some of those old ideas behind what we think we know, who we are, and who we might become. I'm Eldon Taylor, and this is Provocative Enlightenment. All right, last week our show was a repeat because yours truly lost his voice. Bronchitis, they say. 2 weeks ago, our show was all about aging gracefully, and our guest was television icon Linda Evans. Linda shared herself openly, providing valuable insight into the many choices and decisions we make as we age. Celestial B wrote, "Very uplifting show. I thought Linda was refreshing and generous with her candidness and wisdom." Lisa wrote, "Linda is so humble with her sharing. She is just inside-out beauty." Kimberly wrote, "Love the show today. Love the chat room today. Thank you for the inspiring people and subjects." Brian wrote, "I wonder how much wisdom and knowledge we lose in this country because older citizens are fighting to stay out of the home and fearing the day they will not be completely self-sufficient, rather than enjoying the knowledge that they are cherished, respected, and supported as they continue to make journeys around the sun." Connie wrote, "Great show, Dr. Taylor. I was one of the listeners who was too busy listening to call. You and Linda Evans were wonderful." Now, 3 weeks ago, our show featured Major Ed Dames, and we discussed remote viewing and his Kill Shot movie. Dames' appearance stirred up quite a controversy. Among the many letters we received was this one. Quote, "In regards to your last guest on your Hay House radio show and his remote viewing of solar flares in 2013, looks like we could have viewed NASA's site for the same info as well as a similar happening in 1859. Researchers have known about the solar cycle since the mid-1800s, close quote. Now, in checking the information at the NASA site, I did find that solar cycle 24 will peak, they say, in May 2013, with a below-average number of sunspots. The site states, even a below-average cycle is capable of producing severe space weather. The Great Geomagnetic Storm of 1859, for instance, occurred during a solar cycle of about the same size we're predicting for 2013. Now, when I checked the information from 1859, this is what I found. On September 1st to the 2nd, 1859, the largest recorded geomagnetic storm occurred. Excuse me. I'll have that voice back here in just a second. Aurora were seen around the world, even over the Caribbean. Those over the Rocky Mountains were so bright that their glow awoke gold miners, who began preparing breakfast because they thought it was morning. People who happened to be awake in the northeastern U.S. could read a newspaper by the aurora's light. Telegraph systems all over Europe and North America failed, in some cases, shocking telegraph operators. Telegraph pylons threw sparks, and telegraph paper spontaneously caught fire. Some telegraph systems continued to send and receive messages despite having been disconnected from their power supplies. Okay, so we may well have a super light show in store for us, and some interruptions of power and communication, and perhaps even major weather disturbances that cause some damage. Now, for those of you who have expressed worry about this prediction, I stand by my invitation to bring Dames back to the show in 2014 and discuss why his prediction for a barbecued Earth in 2013 simply did not happen. Okay, Karen wrote, "Thank you, Eldon. I listen to you on Hay House and also keep updated on Facebook. You certainly are enlightening. The one thing I wish I could get is your books on CD. I work from home, and I'm so busy the only time I get to read is when I listen to a book on CD while working. Love your work." Well, Hay House has offered that to us, Karen, so I guess I'll have to saddle up to the mic and begin recording the books. Dee Dee wrote, Eldon, I wanted to say thank you for your magnificent CDs on performance anxiety and overcoming fear of rejection. These have been instrumental in my success performing in front of large crowds like the New York Yankees and NBA Thunder. Thank you. Well, wow. Great job, Dee Dee. Great job. And as you know, I absolutely love your work. We'll have you on the show not too distant future, and you can sing your way into the entree. This is a woman that does lectures, and she is an entertainer. She sings the lecture. I don't want to spoil it. You just want to be sure and catch Dee Dee when she's scheduled on the show. When is she coming, Ravinder?
Oh, now you've caught me. I have to go look that one up real quickly. She's coming on real soon. But
November, December, anyway, right? For the end of the year?
Yeah.
That's okay. You don't need to look it up.
Sorry.
All right, coming soon. You want to watch.
Actually, it's November 13th.
November 13th. All right. Brenda wrote, I'm watching your video right now from I Can Do It in D.C. Awesome. Thank you so much. Doug wrote, thank you for providing those of us who are on the path with road signs that we see, feel, and hear. Well, thank you, Doug, for your feedback, and it's my pleasure, for I relate to needing just those things myself. Marilyn wrote, I heard you on Pamela Osley's radio program from her website. Yes, 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 resonated through me continuously. Marvelous accomplishments. Thank you for sharing, and here's to shouting it out from all of us. Well, thank you, Marilyn. And if any of you would like to know about my appearances other than here on Hay House Radio, please check the schedule and or the archives at my website, eldontaylor.com. All right, that's all the time we're going to take for letters today. But I do invite you to opine by sending your email to Eldon at eldontaylor.com. That's ELDON. Or by joining me on Facebook. We can't get all of your letters on the air, but they do impact our programming. And once again, I thank you for your feedback and continued support. Now to today's show. I'm excited about this show. The pyramids and the Pentagon, the government's top secret pursuit of mystical relics, ancient astronauts, and lost civilizations. Sound like an Indiana Jones story? How much truth can there really be to scenarios of this kind? Well, our guest today may surprise you. It seems there is much more truth than most would expect. The book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon by Nick Redfern, is a detailed study of how and why government agencies have, for decades, taken a clandestine interest in numerous religious puzzles. Focusing on classified work of the U.S. government, The Pyramids and the Pentagon invites you to take a wild ride into a fog-shrouded past. Our guest, Nick Redfern, works full-time as an author, lecturer, and journalist. He writes about a wide range of unsolved mysteries. His previous books include Keep Out, The Real Men in Black, The NASA Conspiracies, Contactees, and Memoirs of a Monster Hunter. Nick has appeared on numerous radio and television shows and is an active advocate of official disclosure. He has worked to uncover thousands of pages of previously classified Royal Air Force, Air Ministry, and Ministry of Defense files on UFOs dating from the Second World War. Nick has been with us before, so let's just get the man in here. Welcome back to Provocative Enlightenment, Mr. Nick Redfern.
Hey, Eldon, how's it going?
It's going great, sir. I've been really looking forward to this show. Since our last visit, I basically said to the producers, we need to get this guy and bring him on the show on a regular basis, at least once a quarter, because you're just a wealth of knowledge. But before we jump into your book, you're always working on something new and different. What have you been working on since your last visit to the show?
I'm working on a couple of books on my other big interest, which is cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals like Bigfoot, lake monsters, the chupacabra, and that's sort of my other big area of interest beyond sort of UFOs and conspiracies. So I'm working on a couple of those books for next year right now.
Just for the benefit of those people that haven't weren't with us when you were with us before in the last show. Mm-hmm. Please explain what it is that caught your fancy that made these things so interesting to you. Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, it goes back to my father. He was in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar, and he was involved in a couple of UFO incidents where the radar personnel tracked these fast-moving objects flying over the English Channel and the North Sea, in between the British coastline and Scandinavia. And because this was the height of the Cold War, the first thought was, it's got to be the Russians launching a sneak attack. But that didn't turn out to be the case. The fighter pilots were scrambled from a nearby Air Force base and tried to intercept them, and pilots reported seeing these strange lights and silvery saucer-shaped craft, but couldn't get close to them. It was almost like the UFOs were playing sort of a game of cat and mouse with them. And this went on for several days, and everybody involved, from the ground crew, radar people, pilots, was told not to talk about it. And my dad didn't tell me about it till I was about 12 or 13, and that sort of got me interested. And then after I finished school, I began working on a music magazine back in England, and then so I got a background in journalism, and then I decided, why not try and combine the two, the writing with the interest in weird stuff, I guess. So that's kind of what kicked it all off.
See, and I don't think it's weird. I think it's the really interesting stuff that as a child you just absolutely fantasized about.
Well, yeah, when I
fixated
say weird,
even, but then you grow up and you find yourself having to go out and do all these other things, and you grew up and went out and decided you were going to investigate it. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, I've always been of the opinion that that you got one life, so you might as well enjoy it and do what you want. And I decided that this is what I was going to do. This is what I was going to plan. This is what the goal was going to be a writer and write about things I enjoy, and and not have to be stuck in a 9-to-5 thing wearing a suit and tie, which I hate doing. So,
one of these days we're going to sit down, we'll have coffee, tea, or what have you, and spend an afternoon. But tell us about your new book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon. What is this all about? I mean, how do pyramids and pentagons relate?
Well, that's actually a very good question. I mean, over the years, I'm sure like a lot of people who are interested in mysteries and unexplained phenomena, had a deep interest in the whole ancient astronaut scenario. Everything from the likes of the work of Eric von Daniken, Zacharias Sitchin, stories of Atlantis, Edgar Cayce, that kind of thing. But I'd never actually, of all the sort of 20-something books I've written, I'd never written anything on ancient civilizations or ancient astronauts, anything like that at all. But the reason why I chose to do that with the new book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, was because over time I began to get snippets of stories over the course of several years, which suggested that government agencies had been taken an interest in things like how the pyramids were built, the story of Atlantis, the legend of Noah's Ark, things like this. And of course, the big question is, well, why would the CIA and agencies like this even have an interest? So I began digging into them more and more, and over time found that there was this huge backstory there, if you like, that nobody had really dug into before. And that was kind of how and why government agencies have taken an interest in ancient astronauts, mystical relics, and ancient civilizations, like Atlantis and things like that. And eventually, got enough material together where I was able to sort of write an entire book on it. And that's basically what I did. So.
And it's a great book. And I think when I first picked it up, some of the obvious things, the clandestine operations, I have familiarity with, but some of the tactics that were involved, such as exploring a religious ideology with the idea, say, end times, an eschatological event, with the idea that maybe we do a blue beam and well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but with the idea, as you spell out in the book so well, that you create this panic by making people believe that you have an end times. Let's get into specifics. We'll draw that one out later. Okay. How did the CIA become interested in and involved in the 1947 discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, this is a weird story. Goes back, as you said, to 1947 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered a series of caves at a place called Qumran on the Dead Sea, hence the name. Now, you would imagine, and quite rightly, that, this would be an issue for like theologians, historians, archaeologists, which it certainly was. This large collection of Dead Sea Scrolls is now sort of famously on display. But there's an interesting story that links the Dead Sea Scrolls with the CIA. and it came from a man named Miles Copeland, who was a senior operative in the CIA in the 1940s onwards, when the CIA was established. And he was working out in the Middle East at the time, and he spoke about how, actually in the city of Damascus, and he spoke about how on one particular day this mysterious character came into the building. His office was in the American Embassy in Damascus, and unrolled this huge parchment, which looked very ancient and archaic, and had this writing on that that nobody could really decipher. But Copeland realized this was something of significance. And whoever this mysterious character was, he said he wanted someone to decipher it, and so he chose the CIA. And how he even knew the CIA had this clandestine office in the building, that was a mystery in itself. But nevertheless, Miles Copeland agreed to have this information and the scroll itself actually sent for analysis to the CIA. And Copeland went public on this story when he was a very old man in the sort of 50, 60 years after the experience occurred. And he spoke about how word got back to him that when it was deciphered by experts in ancient languages, they concluded that it was related to the book of Daniel and dealt with everything from like strange dreams to prophecies and foretelling the future and things like this. And what's interesting is this actually ties in with the very early years of when the CIA was doing what later would become known as remote viewing. That's to say, using the mind in sort of psychic warfare situations. And it seems to be the case that the CIA may actually have took some inspiration from this ancient text, if you like, and used it as like a springboard for their ESP-based research, because it dealt with things, as I said, like visions and prophecies. And it seems to be that was the reason for why even today the CIA actually won't even acknowledge they've got that particular scroll. It's not like they say the stories are nonsense. Their official response is, we can neither confirm nor deny the story, which is a sort of typical roundabout way of saying it's true, but go away.
Right. That is exactly right. You probably heard in the setup piece that a couple of weeks ago we had Major Ed Dames, who headed the SRA, Stanford Research Associates. So the viewers like Ingo Swann and the scientists like Harold Putoff were under his command. Mm-hmm. And, he indicated in the radio show a couple of weeks ago that his Soviet counterpart and he have since shared stories and tales, and they both now teach remote viewing privately, one in Russia and one, of course, here. Continuing with, these connections, I just kind of want to do an ABC. I mean, sure. Tell me, how does the U.S. government, or why, I should say, has the U.S. government taken so much interest in Noah's Ark?
Well, this is probably the strangest, or at least one of the strangest stories I've got in the book. It goes back to 1949, 2 years after the whole situation with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And American intelligence, by British intelligence, had got hold of a story that the Russians were building up a new military base on the border of Turkey with the former Soviet Union, on the border somewhere. And because this was seen as a threat to the Western Europe, etc., that a spy mission was launched where a U.S. spy plane took off from a base in Europe and with the plan to fly as close as it could to this military base and get some high-flying aerial photographs. And the guys on board the plane, they used Mount Ararat, Turkey, as like a guiding pointer to reach the base. It was basically, fly over the mountain and keep going in one particular direction, and they would come to this sort of clandestine base that was being constructed. Now, Mount Ararat, of course, is where, according to the Bible, Noah's Ark came to land after the flood. And as the guys got near the top of the mountain, Mount Ararat is basically about 17,000 feet high. And, contrary to a lot of people think that it's like a hot desert country, that high up, the top 3,000 or 4,000 feet, are actually permanently snow and ice covered all year round. It's like the Himalayas or Everest up there. And as they approached the mountain, one of the guys on board the plane reported seeing that he could see what looked like sticking out of the ice, literally like about a 600-foot-long wing-like structure, like the wing of an aircraft. And they got permission from ground personnel to swing the plane around and take some photographs of it, which is what they did. As they were turning the plane, one of the other guys on the opposing window said he could see a similar wing on a slightly adjacent face of the mountain. So they also got pictures of that, which was also described as like a 600-foot long wing. Then they continued on with the original mission and then returned to base. Now, of course, when these pictures were analysed, one of which actually managed to get through the Freedom of Information Act, which is in the book, they showed what looked like two dark-coloured wing-like structures, each about 600 feet long. Now, of course, nobody back then, or even now, of course, was building aircraft with an overall wing width of 1,200 feet. You know, it's just not feasible. But that's what these things look like. And, of course, these photographs became of deep interest to U.S. intelligence, not just because of the location being Mount Ararat, but also because they didn't actually fit the conventional description of Noah's Ark of being like a 600-foot long wooden boat. They looked like wings. You know, this wasn't like the equivalent of a rotted old hull of a boat or anything like that. And the photographs were shared with the CIA, with the U.S. Air Force, the National Reconnaissance Office, and a couple of other departments, all who had a vested interest in trying to determine what this was. And again, I used the Freedom of Information Act and got about 70 pages of files from the CIA, which made it very clear that they'd followed this story for years in terms of actually even flying spy satellites over Turkey and getting very high-resolution photographs in the 1970s. And within the CIA, this became known as the Ararat anomaly. And what's particularly interesting is that a number of these agencies, including the CIA, collected stories, very often from like published books, you know, where they would photocopy them, where people were talking about the idea that Noah's Ark, instead of being like an ancient wooden vessel, was like a UFO or like an alien ark, actually filled with like animal DNA. You know, in other words, it was like a huge space ark that collected specimens of animal DNA from all around the world in the event that or they obviously foresaw this flood coming and used this to sort of reseed the planet afterwards. And now, whether or not that's true, the mere fact that all this material was held by these agencies suggests that's why they were looking into the mystery of what this thing was on Mount Ararat. They felt it was, in simple terms, like an ancient Roswell or something like that.
You know, and I guess that kind of begs the question too, Nick, and I'm going to ask you for a bottom line answer because we're coming up on a hard break. You tend to see these stories like Noah's Ark as either, you know, mythology represented by something that really happened, and or this is, you know, a biblical, the God did appear, you know, literal. Which way do you take that? Well,
you know, I mean, I think there's no doubt from the photographs that something is on Mount Ararat. You know, I mean, religion is obviously, you know, a very controversial issue that polarizes people into different areas. My personal view...
I'm going to have to ask you to hold it on that.
Okay,
when we come back, your personal view is what we're going to ask for, all right? You're listening to Provocative Enlightenment on HayHouseRadio.com, radio that goes anywhere and everywhere. Our guest today is Mr. Nick Redfern, and we're discussing his book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon. Now, if you're not already in our chat room, this is a great time to join in the conversation. We have a short film of Nick that will be shown during our break. Just go to eldontaylor.com/chat. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss what's coming up after these words from some of our friends.
Confusion, deception, manipulation, feeling a bit controlled, lost. Learn how you can take back control of your life through proven techniques in Eldon Taylor's revised edition of Choices and Illusions. This New York Times bestseller is a guidebook to your journey to self-actualization, filled with practical, real-life solutions backed by scientific studies and guaranteed to awaken your inner genie. Get your copy today from all books.
Have you talked to yourself lately? What does that inner voice say? Are you constantly hearing negative feedback? Ready for a change? Inner Talk, Eldon Taylor's patented subliminal technology, can do just that. Change your inner self-talk. Turn off the negative by replacing it with positive affirmations. Inner Talk has been researched at universities such as Stanford and by governments around the world, and has been proven effective at priming your self-talk. Armed with a new positive outlook, you'll find everything becomes easier, from losing weight to stop smoking, giving presentations to riding horses. Learn new things to being a powerful salesperson. Choose your title for change today. Visit www.innertalk.com. That's INNERTALK.com. Innertalk.com.
Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, we're speaking with Nick Redfern about his great read, Pyramids in the Pentagon. But before we get back to today's show, I want to remind you to join me on Facebook as a friend or a fan. You will always know where we are and what's on next when you do. Plus, many of the announcements only happen on my Facebook pages or in my newsletter. So if you're not receiving your free copy of my newsletter, be sure to sign up for it when you visit my website. All right, let's get back to the show. Before the break, Nick, you were about to share your personal take on this whole matter of myth based on historical incident versus, say, biblical recount of God's interaction, or what Jewish people might say, Yahweh's intercourse with man.
Yeah, I mean, my view has always been, Eldon, that, when you're dealing with stories from the distant past that have been sort of translated and retranslated, and they tell stories that are very literal but fantastic, we have to be careful how we interpret them. And that's not meant to offend anybody, but it's just a fact that when you're dealing with something like Noah's Ark, where supposedly two animals, every animal on the planet, were taken on board this ship, you have to ask the question, or I do at least, how, did Noah travel to every country around the world and get two of every animal, where some of them, how do you get a fully grown man-eating lion and a female lion on board the Ark without getting eaten yourself? How did you then travel to the North Pole to get penguins, or the South Pole to get polar bears, all before the flood hits? It's like, when you break it down, to me, it reads more like a distorted story of a real-life event where certain people, where there was a worldwide flood, I do believe that, and I think certain people survived it, and there may be some sort of intervention. Some people would say God, some people would say ancient aliens, but I think the danger is interpreting these stories literally when they clearly have flaws in them that, in terms of the logic of how you would get all these animals on board and why it wouldn't sink under the weight of them all,
Sure. Since you've brought that subject up, let's just jump a little bit here, and we'll come back. I want to get to the pyramids. That's what I mean. But Oppenheimer has often been associated with the idea that there were earlier civilizations that pre-existed us. And indeed, I believe, your book basically states that he may have had some secret knowledge of a localized nuclear war that was fought in India. Flesh that story out for us. Tell us what you know about these, at least the ideas that are held by intelligent people, including our intelligence community. I don't mean that as an oxymoron. The views that they might have regarding this, Nick.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting story. This goes back to, Robert Oppenheimer first was, the father, the brains behind the atomic bomb. First one detonated in the New Mexico desert in July 45, just before the two main ones that were dropped on Japan, and, which brought the Second World War to an end. The first one was basically like a test bomb. Nobody really knew what effect it was going to have. They just thought, oh, we got a lot of New Mexico desert, we'll just do it there and hope for the best, But over the years, Oppenheimer began to sort of rue and regret creating the atomic bomb. He was sort of kind of like Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, He kind of regretted bringing it to life, so to speak. And he actually became more of a champion for peace, which sort of didn't please the U.S. military, and that's why he eventually lost his top secret clearance, because there were suspicions, that although worries that he would sort of derail the program or whatever. But he had a fascination that I would arguably say bordered upon an obsession with an ancient Indian text called the Mahabharata, which I mean, some estimates suggest it goes back to about 8,000 BC. Other estimates suggest that the Mahabharata itself is actually based on an even older story, possibly going back 30 or 40,000 years, which would be, would literally rewrite the history books, in terms of when civilization began. But that's one of the suggestions. And it talks about this war in northern India between two basically warring factions. Now, of course, you would imagine the dawn of history. This would be a battle sort of fought on horseback with shields and bows and arrows and spears and lances, that kind of thing. But when you read it, it actually talks about the soldiers taking to the air in these craft that were called vimanas, which sound, when you read the descriptions, they sound like high-flying equivalents of today's fighter planes. And they would unleash these sort of bolts of iron at the opposing cities, which would be just flattened in like an instant. There would be this gigantic flash of light, and this huge plume of smoke would loom into the air for miles and just hang there for weeks or days. And it also talks about how the soldiers and the people of the cities, in the immediate days and hours afterwards from the explosion, they'd start to fall sick. Their nails would fall out, their hair would fall out, etc., etc., and they'd just fall sick and die. Now, when you look at all this actually sounds eerily like, the flash of light is like the atomic bomb. This huge plume of smoke just hangs and hangs there. It's kind of like the atomic mushroom cloud that everybody knows. And the hair falling out, the nails falling out, people sick and then dying after the explosion in the hours and days later, sounds suspiciously like radiation and radiation poisoning. And so, but then we have to bear in mind that this is, from a text from thousands of years ago. Now, Oppenheimer actually did come to believe in the idea that we weren't the first civilization to achieve atomic power. He didn't necessarily think there was a gigantic worldwide civilization like ours, but possibly in certain localized areas, they may have flourished and it tapped into something that, took us years to find, but then recklessly destroyed themselves and have become sort of just mythology. For example, in 1952, when he was at a seminar in Washington, D.C., he was asked about these rumors, were the first 3 atomic bombs we exploded, the one in New Mexico and the 2 in Japan, the first ones? And Oppenheimer said, yes, they were. And then he paused and added, in modern times, as if he was trying to basically get a little bit of the secret out without, compromising his own position in terms of security. But he was actually somebody who became obsessed with the Mahabharata and the idea that, there were people before us who destroyed themselves.
It's really interesting. I think just about everybody is familiar with some of these stories, but we put them off to myth and legend, as opposed to sometimes look at the documents like you have done, and then attempt to explain the feasibility, the possibility of this taking place within the context, like you say, on horseback with swords and shields. Let me ask you this. Going straight to the pyramids, I have seen all kinds of theories on how these massive stones were put in place. I've seen discovery shows where, hundreds, thousands of men using various devices, moving stones, tried to float them from the quarries and so on and so forth. I think the most popular theory is the idea that somehow they levitated these stones into place. Is that a theory that would hold? I mean, has the Pentagon looked at that?
Well, actually, they have, as bizarre as it sounds, and it actually goes back to the pyramids where they took some of the inspiration from. Now, if you look at the Egyptian pyramids, or the very similar pyramids, but they're slightly different at least, in South America and Central America, and also ancient Rome, Greece, and Stonehenge in Britain, all of these different countries, people, and cultures they all have near identical legends and folklore where they all talk about the stones, these huge stones, sometimes weighing up to 80 tons, were sort of floated into place. They weren't pulled by ropes, pulleys, and, levers or anything like that. All these cultures talk about the stones being what today we would call levitated. And what's interesting is that they all have, it sounds a bit odd when I'm going to say what I'm going to say now, but they all talk about the stones being moved to the sound of music. There are stories about magical instruments, musical instruments, being plucked like ancient guitars, and the stones would raise up. But what they're actually talking about in a distorted fashion is something the military has been secretly trying to develop for a long time, which is called acoustic levitation. And basically, it's where you have what's called opposing acoustic frequencies that create what's called a resonance zone between them. And if you amplify and direct these acoustic frequencies, you can actually raise objects within this so-called resonance zone. And the military so far has only had success lifting small objects, but they have had success. And this is basically, so you're using sound to levitate objects. And this sounds very much like, albeit in sort of a, passed down through the generations by word of mouth scenario, that the ancients were talking about when they talked about, the stones being lifted into the air to the sound of music and to sound. Another classic example is how this could be weaponized. The famous story of the walls of Jericho. They weren't kicked down; they were brought down to the sound of a trumpet. And again, this is like using acoustic technology as a weapon. Now, whether or not this is true, one of the things I point out in the book, whether that scenario is true, that is how they did it. As I point out in the book, the Pentagon in the 50s was particularly interested in the research of a man named Dr. Morris Jessup, who wrote a book called The Case for the UFO, which postulated this very theory of levitation. And rather than ignore him or just throw the book out, the Navy actually secretly flew him out to D.C. and sort of grilled him for days all about his research and how this technology might work and whether or not, there was a chance of developing it and weaponizing it, basically. So, they took the theory very seriously that, levitation was at the heart of the raising of these massive stones.
Yeah, frequencies, I think we most of us know, can be very damaging, very dangerous, easily weaponized. The opera singer's voice shatters the glass, not too unlike.
Exactly.
In fact, some of the declassified information that comes out of the Cold War tells us that utilizing frequencies and very specific frequency patterns, the Soviets experimented on. Bombarding our embassies with frequencies that interrupted the optimal operation of the nervous system, producing all kinds of strange maladies. Let me ask this. Do you think that our government, the Pentagon, the British government, do you think they believe that there were ancient civilizations and that they perhaps destroyed themselves?
Yeah, I think there are people in government who believe that. There's no doubt about that. I think the big question is whether, to what extent, they can prove it or not. It's kind of like, with the best will in the world, even from the government's perspective, when you're dealing with stories that may date back, like the Mahabharata, tens of thousands of years, and somewhere has been obliterated, and all you've got are sort of, ancient tablets or manuscripts and parchments, it becomes difficult to actually prove it. So there's no doubt, though, that because of the paths that they were looking at and trying to determine things like, the levitation angle or what was on Mount Ararat, etc., there's no doubt that there were people who were driven by that belief. Whether they actually sort of vindicated or proved it, that's a different matter, I think.
There have been, of course, all kinds of black ops, if you will, dealing with everything from what you're talking about, the ancient cults, etc., to, brainwashing, which is something I spend a little more time on. But let me ask you this. Have you come across in your work Devil's Breath, scopolamine?
No, I haven't, no.
Okay, well, that's a drug that is available in South America that apparently it hasn't been in the States for a long time, but apparently it's now coming into the States, and it's they call it devil's breath because you give a person this drug and it basically suspends their critical ability to resist, and the end result of that is it's thought of as a willpower drug. But that's a whole nother subject. We'll talk about that another time. Tell me this then, Nick. Can you explain what NASA and other agencies of government have learned about the connection between ancient Egypt and the face and Mars?
Yeah, this is an area that sort of has profound implications. I guess for us as a species and for our history. I mean, I'm sure all of your listeners will have heard of the so-called face on Mars. It's sort of this enigmatic, almost sphinx-like face that stares up from an area of Mars called Cydonia. And, if you see it, it does look like the Egyptian Sphinx, but whereas the Sphinx points outwards, the face on Mars points upwards. More intriguing is that in the same area, Cydonia, NASA photographs show what look eerily like pyramid-type structures. And, of course, this sort of connection between having a Sphinx-type face and pyramids nearby on Mars has inevitably given rise to the theory that, could there be a tie-in between some ancient indigenous Martian race that maybe destroyed itself again, or possibly something happened to the planet itself where its atmosphere degraded, and some of the original Martian civilization, if you like, fled to Earth and kick-started some of our human civilizations. Now, it's a controversial theory, certainly, but one of the undeniable facts is that many ancient cultures had a fascination with Mars, with the planet Mars. They would celebrate it, in terms of cave paint drawings, even for example, sort of building structures that, sort of paid homage to Mars and also to Venus. And so, in other words, it suggested that somewhere in the ancient past, there was something profound about Mars that influenced the people of that era. And it's also a fact that many of these early cultures that built pyramid-type structures, kind of like the ones that we do see on these NASA pictures, suddenly appeared out of nowhere as if something really had given them a kickstart. We didn't see, like we do in other countries, like a slow progression from horse and carts and the wheel, to the industrial age, to, the jet engines and the atomic age and spacecraft. It was like they went from hunter-gatherers to moving 80-ton stones, almost overnight, as if somebody had helped them. Now, what's interesting is that over the years, a number of agencies have taken an interest in the face on Mars, not just NASA. And there are also indications that possibly somebody in government knew about the face on Mars long before NASA supposedly found it or photographed it first in 1976. That's when it was officially discovered, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But back in the 1950s, a number of sci-fi authors, all interestingly enough, who had various ties to U.S. intelligence, which, as strange as it sounds, began writing novels and comic books all about large faces on Mars and pyramids. Jack Kirby, who was a famous comic book artist who did a lot of the so-called superhero comics of the 60s, he actually wrote a comic book called The Face on Mars in the late 1950s, which details the story of the team of U.S. astronauts who go to Mars and find this huge carved face on the planet. And Kirby, interestingly enough, had a number of ties with the CIA and various agencies over the years. And there's a theory that perhaps at some point in the 50s, there was a moment where certain people in government wanted to get the truth out, and they did it first through sort of the medium of entertainment to see how people would respond to it. But then it was reportedly shut down by another faction of the government that didn't want the truth to come out and, who wanted to relegate it all to, it's just rocks and shadows,
How do you think they would have obtained the information in the first place, Nick?
Well, that's the big question. If they did, and it is speculation, my speculation would be that it would come from interpreting and deciphering ancient manuscripts and texts and things like this, that possibly were sort of retrieved, liberated, purloined or whatever, kind of like this ancient Dead Sea Scroll that supposedly the CIA got in 1947 that dealt with things like prophecy and foretelling the future and things like that. I suspect that it would have to come from ancient knowledge. You know, I don't think we were flying spacecraft to Mars in the 50s that saw the face on Mars, but possibly the idea of having archaic knowledge, secret knowledge and esoteric knowledge, and having located it and deciphered it, I think that's probably a more probable scenario.
Well, while we're on that, you know, you recount how the FBI clandestinely investigated claims of UFOs. Researcher and witness George Van Tassel. Flesh that story out, will you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, you know, when you think of ancient astronauts, everybody tends to think in more recent years, Zechariah Sitchin, and then in the 60s and 70s, Eric von Daniken. But George Van Tassel was someone who was talking about ancient astronauts back in the 50s, at the same time as Morris Jessup, who postulated on the Egyptian pyramids being moved by levitation. But George Van Tassel, I got hold of his FBI file, which is like 400 pages long and spans about 15 years. And there's quite a bit in there about how the government was deeply interested in his beliefs that, interestingly enough, Noah's Ark was some sort of spacecraft, like a space ark populated by animals that aliens had sort of taken on board, almost like a cosmic zoo. He also came to believe, Van Tassel, that the story of Adam and Eve, he believed that it was Adam and Eve were like a race of extraterrestrials, or two races of extraterrestrials, not sort of one literal man and one literal woman. He also believed that many sort of biblical accounts, like the Star of Bethlehem and things like that, were evidence of UFO activity. And he lectured on this quite extensively in the 50s and 60s, and as a result, you know, got watched by sort of U.S. officialdom. And this went on for a long, long time, to the point where it becomes very clear that the reason why he was being watched specifically did relate to the fact that he was kind of rewriting ancient religious texts. And there was a lot of concern about how that would influence people in the general public in the U.S. at that particular time. And it demonstrates, you know, he's very much ahead of his time as well, in terms of, you know, people like von Daniken and Sitchin, you know, coming decades later after him.
Right. You know, I think obviously one of the concerns is if you were to discover that life was seeded by some extraterrestrial, your Adam and Eve story isn't the biblical recount as most Christians believe, or you can take any of the creation epics. It would dissolve their credibility, and that could give rise to a good deal of confusion.
Yeah.
At the same time, it might also neutralize some of the tactics that government has laid in place for how they might control the masses by playing towards those very scripts. In about 1 minute, can you fill us in on why the government might want to take advantage of your belief in Christianity? I'm thinking particularly of Castro.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting story about how in the early 1960s, this is a verifiable story where I got the files again through the Freedom of Information Act, that the CIA developed this fantastic plan to sort of fake Second Coming, where the plan was, bear in mind this is the early 60s, so the technology was fairly rudimentary then, but the plan was to try and basically sort of project imagery of Jesus onto low-lying clouds over Cuba, and have aircraft with their engines muffled flying inside the clouds, broadcasting messages to the Cuban people saying, you know, renounce Fidel Castro, Jesus is on our side. So in other words, it was like utilizing religion and creating a fake second return to try and overthrow, you know, a foreign leader. And, you know, and when that ties in today, we hear things about Project Bluebeam, and people say, well, that's just not possible, you know, that's just too far out. But we actually find that the government had tried to do something very similar, albeit with more rudimentary technology 50 years earlier.
We're out of time, Nick. Listen, all of you out there, the book is The Pyramids and the Pentagon. It is a great read. We could spend hours on this. We will be bringing Nick back to discuss more, especially what the National Security Agency and crop circles and the 2012 End of the World controversy is all about. You get the book. That's it. We've come to the end of another hour of Provocative Enlightenment. I want to thank our guest and all of you for joining us, and a special thank you A shout out to our Hay House Radio crew that does everything for us behind the scenes and makes it all so easy every week. All right, if you have comments on the show, do let us know. And until next time, wherever you are in the world, remember, believing in yourself always matters.